Welcome. Today we're talking about HTMA. Now, this is something that most people have heard of, but once you understand it, it can completely change how you look at your symptoms. Because a lot of you have probably had labs done and been told everything looks normal, but you just don't feel right. What HTMA does is give us a different kind of information. It doesn't just look at isolated numbers, it shows patterns. And those patterns often explain why things haven't been adding up for you. So today I'm going to walk you through what it is, why we use it, and how it connects to what you're experiencing. Take a second and think about this. How many of you had labs done and been told that everything looks normal? Nothing flagged, nothing concerning, and yet you don't feel normal. Energy isn't where it should be, your digestion feels off, maybe you have some mood changes or anxiety that doesn't make sense. That disconnect is where people get stuck. And one of the most common things I hear is, I don't understand. If everything is normal, why do I feel like this? That question is actually the right question because it points to something important. The issue isn't always that nothing is wrong. Sometimes it's that the way we're looking isn't showing the full picture. And that's what we're going to unpack. Understanding that gap really is what leads into how most lab testing actually works. So looking at this from a different angle helps explain what's happening. Most lab testing is designed to answer a very specific question. Is there something seriously wrong? And that's useful in acute situation, in like an emergency situation. It's not very helpful when someone feels off but doesn't have a clear diagnosis. I have an example here that kind of makes it easier to see. Someone goes in for labs because they're exhausted all the time. And the blood work comes back, everything is within range, they're told everything looks fine. And nothing changes. The fatigue is still there. And that situation isn't rare, it happens all the time. And part of the reason is how labs are structured. They give a snapshot, a single moment in time, and the body doesn't work that way. It's constantly adjusting, compensating, shifting to maintain that stability. Blood is really tightly controlled, and the body prioritizes keeping those levels within a narrow range, even if it has to borrow from other areas to do it. And that can create a gap. The blood might look stable, while deeper imbalances are building in the background. And then there's the reference range, of course. Normal just means that a value falls in between or within a wide statistical range. It doesn't mean optimal. It doesn't mean everything is functioning well. And plenty of people sit in that range and they still feel tired, off, not like themselves. And this is where the frustration comes from. Nothing is technically wrong, but something clearly isn't right. And that gap is what leads us to look at a different type of information. So that's where a test like HTMA comes in. It looks at the body from a completely different perspective. Now, HTMA stands for hair tissue mineral analysis. At a basic level, it's measuring the mineral content in the hair. And that sounds simple, but what makes it useful is what that sample represents. Hair is a tissue, and it reflects what's happening at the tissue level, not just what's circulating in the blood at that exact moment. Another important difference is time. Hair grows gradually, which means it captures information over a longer period of time. Instead of a snapshot, it gives a trend, and that shift from snapshot to a trend is what makes this test so valuable. Most people have only seen lab work that reflects what's happening right now in this moment. HTMA can give us insight into what the body has been doing over weeks and even months. Now, you might ask, why have I never heard of this test? And this type of testing has actually been used in public health monitoring and in research settings for decades, since the 60s. It has been used with astronauts in NASA-related programs, and the CDC uses it to monitor exposure to things like heavy metals. And yet at the same time, it's not widely used in conventional medicine. And I don't think that's because the data is meaningless, but maybe because the approach is different. Conventional labs focus on acute changes in disease markers. The HTMA test, or this approach, looks at trends and balance and patterns that happen over time. It's not designed to look for disease. It looks how well the body is functioning. And that difference is likely why it is not being used in conventional medicine, but also why it's so helpful in a situation where everything else looks normal, but something still just feels off. So to really understand why this matters, it helps to look at how the body prioritizes blood over tissue. You know, blood, I've already mentioned, it's tightly regulated. The body has to keep those levels within a very narrow window or range to maintain the basic functions. And that stability is really not optional. It's a survival mechanism. Take potassium, for example. The optimal range is 3.5 to 5.2. If the blood level falls outside of that range, you can develop dysrhythmias or abnormal heartbeats that can ultimately lead to death. So in order to maintain the balance, the body will adjust constantly. And one of the ways it does that is by pulling resources from tissue or depositing, keep those blood levels stable. And they can also get deposited in those same areas if there's an excess. And that creates a situation where blood looks normal while tissues are becoming depleted or oversaturated. So when someone is dealing with fatigue or poor recovery and they go see their doctor and they get blood work done, more often than not, it will come back normal. Now, from a conventional perspective, nothing really stands out. From a tissue perspective, however, the body may already be compensating. Minerals may be getting redistributed to keep that blood level stable. And that compensation can go on for quite a while. Your body will work very hard to keep you alive for as long as possible. It's not that it has a conscience, or it probably does, but it's in self-interest to not die. So it'll cut a corner here and cut a corner there. It'll rob Peter to pay Paul for as long as possible. And by the time something shows up, you know, clearly out of range in blood work, the imbalance has usually been present for a really long time. And this is why people often feel symptoms long before anything shows up on standard labs. Now, another layer to keep in mind here is that homeostasis is protective, but it can also mask early imbalances. And I think that's really just reiterates the point. The body is doing its job, but that doesn't mean everything is functioning optimally. So looking at the tissue gives a different perspective. It helps answer a different question. Not just, are you stable, but actually, are you functioning well? So when we look at these tissue patterns, that also opens up another layer, how minerals can interact with each other and sometimes also interfere. Minerals don't just sit in isolation. They rely on receptors, they rely on enzymes and pathways to actually do their job. And when those systems are disrupted, you know, the function changes, even if the intake looks adequate. And we call that molecular mimicry. Certain elements can take the place of essential minerals, but they don't actually activate the same processes. they can affect things at multiple levels. So at the receptor level, if the wrong element is occupying that space on the receptor, the signal doesn't get transmitted properly. For example, we have fluoride and chlorine and bromine that have a tendency to occupy iodine receptor sites. Iodine is used by all cells in the body, but most of you are probably familiar with how important it is to thyroid function. So when those sites are blocked, then the iodine can't do its job and the thyroid won't function optimally. Now, at the enzyme level, enzymes often require specific minerals to function. They're the catalyst to make the process happen. If a toxic metal is interfering, then that reaction slows down or it doesn't happen in the first place. And that can have many downstream effects on metabolism, energy production, detoxification, all those things. Now, inflammation is another piece. Certain metals, like aluminum, for example, have been associated with increased inflammation, especially in neurological tissue. And that can affect how the brain functions over time. And it can also lead to dementia and Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative disorders. And then there's also the interactions with essential minerals. For example, mercury, very commonly used in dental fillings. Even to this day, it's still allowed to be used. But mercury has an affinity for selenium. And selenium plays an important role in antioxidant systems and then also in thyroid function again. So if mercury is present, it can bind to selenium and reduce its availability. It binds to selenium so tightly that the body has a hard time taking it apart, and then it recognizes it as a toxin and it'll store it away in the tissues. So that creates another situation where the body has the nutrient present, but it can't use it because it's bound to mercury. And so this is where things can become more complex than just what is my intake. And someone can do a lot of things right, eating well, supplementing with the proper supplements, and still feel like there is just no progress. Not because nothing is working, but because something is interfering with how the body is using those inputs. And that's part of what these patterns can start to reveal. So when you start seeing those kinds of interactions, it becomes clear why looking at individual numbers doesn't really give the full picture. Most people are used to looking at lab work in terms of single values. A number is either in range or it's out of range. And that approach works for certain things, but it doesn't explain how systems are functioning. The body doesn't operate one value at a time. It operates through relationships. Minerals influence each other. They affect how enzymes function, how signals are sent, how our energy is produced. And you can clearly see that on the image, how everything is connected. A single number just cannot capture that. But a pattern, however, it does. A pattern shows how different pieces are interacting. It shows us a direction. It shows whether the body is compensating or slowing down or under stress. A simple way to think about it is that a single number is a data point. A pattern tells a whole story. And that story is what connects to the symptoms. Energy, digestion, hormones, mood, all of those depend on all the systems working together. So when the relationships are off, and then the function changes. And looking at patterns allows you to see that shift. It moves the question from, is it normal, to what is the body actually doing? And that change in perspective is what makes this test really so useful. So when you start looking at patterns this way, certain ones tend to show up over and over again. Now, they don't look the exact same way in every person, but the overall direction, it just tends to repeat. One pattern is what I think of as the depletion state. Those are people who have been running under stress for a while. It's work stress, poor sleep, undereating, overexercising, sometimes all of the above. And over time, the body starts burning through those resources faster than it can replenish them. And what it looks like in real life is pretty consistent. It's low energy, but the system doesn't really fully shut down. There's often a wired feeling layered on top of fatigue, and sleep may not actually feel restorative. And so just almost like a burnout pattern. Another pattern is more of a slowed state. Things don't move the way they should. The digestion slows down, bowel movements become, less regular, energy feels flat rather than wired. People often describe it as feeling heavy or sluggish. A third pattern that shows up is as an imbalance, not necessarily extreme in one direction, but things aren't working together the way they should. You might have inconsistent energy, mood fluctuations or mood swings. Hormones might feel unstable. I actually can tell you about a client I worked with that came to me with a mix of symptoms that really might not seem like they're connected at first glance. She was dealing with ongoing fatigue, not just being tired, but low energy that didn't even improve with rest. And then constipation had been an issue for a while, inconsistent bowel movements, but really persistent enough to also affect how she felt from her day to day. And her hormones also fell off. Cycles were inconsistent. She had mood swings and just didn't really feel like herself. And those symptoms are often treated as separate issues. So you might go to a gastroenterologist for your digestion, you might go to your GYN for the hormones, and then the primary care for the fatigue. And so all these things get addressed separately. And, energy gets addressed in one way, digestion another, and hormones something else entirely. But we ran an HTMA, and what stood out wasn't just the individual numbers, it was the overall pattern. Everything pointed towards that slower state. Metabolism wasn't running efficiently, digestion had slowed down, the motility was reduced, which helps explain, of course, the constipation. And then energy production was lower, which connects to the fatigue. And then finally, the hormone signaling was being affected as well because those systems rely on adequate energy and proper mineral balance. So having the knowledge of this pattern early on really gave us a good direction in which path to move on. So instead of trying to manage each symptom separately, we focused on supporting the overall pattern, the whole body system pattern from the beginning. And that really allowed things to improve in a more consistent way, not necessarily faster, but not so many back and forths and ups and downs and trials and errors rather than short time changes that, often don't last. And so that connection is what changed everything. So instead of looking at fatigue, digestion, and hormones as separate problems, we start to see them as part of the same pattern. And then once that is clear, you're not guessing anymore. You're no longer playing that game of trial and error. Well, will this supplement work, or will this medicine work, or will this practice work? So you're working with the body and supporting it in what it's actually trying to do. Now let's bring this back to you. Think about your own symptoms or issues for a minute. Not just one, but the whole combination of it, whether it's energy or digestion or mood or hormones, whatever it is for you. Most people have been taught to look at those separately. Different problems, different doctors, different fixes, and a different way to look at it is to ask, do these actually follow a pattern? For example, if anxiety shows up alongside fatigue, that often points towards depletion. The system is running low, or the body is running low on resources, but it hasn't fully shut down yet. If constipation shows up with low energy and sluggish digestion, then that tends to reflect a slower metabolism. And, things aren't moving efficiently. If energy is inconsistent and mood fluctuates and hormones feel off, that often reflects a mineral imbalance. and the pieces aren't working together. So what matters isn't memorizing these categories. What matters is recognizing that all the symptoms are connected. They tend to move together. They also tend to shift together. And that's a clue. Once you start seeing that, it really should change your question. Not how do I fix this one thing, but what pattern is my body following and how can I support it? So I brought you an example test here, and I want you to take a look at that for a second. You don't need to understand everything or anything on here. That's not the goal. What matters is what this test represents. This is an example of a pattern, not just individual numbers. So in this case, in the very first circle, you can see that the calcium and magnesium are high and the sodium and potassium are low, and that really points towards a slower direction, a slow metabolism. It's not running efficiently. So energy production is lower than it should be, which lines up with how this person feels day to day. So fatigue is present even with rest, and the energy is just low. So in the second circle, you can see that iron and copper are low, then these minerals are important for energy production and oxygen utilization. So when they're low, it becomes harder for the body to produce and use energy efficiently. So that's part of why fatigue shows up. And then, of course, we have this one on the bottom, the calcium potassium ratio that shows 25.33. And this gives us also, again, insight into the metabolic rate. When this ratio is elevated like this, it's another indicator that things are really have slowed down. And there's a really practical example on how this shows up. Calcium actually plays a role in how cells respond to signals, including thyroid hormone. So when calcium is elevated at the tissue level like this, it can interfere how thyroid hormone actually gets into the cell. So now you have a situation where the body is producing thyroid hormone, blood work may look normal, TSH may be completely within range. And from a standard lab perspective, everything looks fine. But at the cellular level, that signal isn't being received. The hormone isn't doing what it's supposed to do because it can't get into the cell. And what does that look like? Fatigue, slow metabolism, feeling sluggish, cold intolerances, weight gain, hair loss, all the things associated with low thyroid function. Although the thyroid is functioning, it's just the hormone can't get into the cell. And their blood labs won't reflect that. So this is one example of how patterns can explain symptoms that don't really make sense on paper. And none of these things exist in isolation. They reinforce each other. That's the pattern. Instead of guessing where to start, this gives direction. It tells us what the body is doing and how to begin supporting it. So this is why this matters. A lot of people end up feeling like something is wrong with them. Things aren't working the way they should. And nothing they try seems to fully fix it or move the needle. And it's where this idea comes in. You're not broken. Your body is doing something, it just hasn't been clearly understood yet. Now, the second piece is you're not guessing anymore. Most people are trying things based on general advice. Try this supplement, try this diet, try this routine, something you saw on TV or Instagram. And sometimes those things help a little, but sometimes they don't. And that can get frustrating really fast. So looking at patterns gives you a better starting point. You're working off of what your body is actually doing. And then the last piece is that there is always a pattern, even if it hasn't been obvious up to this point. Symptoms don't just show up randomly. They tend to follow a direction. They tend to move in a certain direction. So once you can see that, you stop chasing symptoms and you start understanding what's driving them. And that's where things then start to shift. So with that, I'm curious what kind of questions you have, or if you're watching this later, what symptoms are still not adding up for you? Because that's usually where we need to look a little deeper. See you next time.